I'm particularly glad to talk about this topic because it's an important one. So just to share a little bit more about myself, my business card says Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary and Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute. But I think in addition to being a follower of Jesus, one of the most important things about me for tonight's topic is that I'm a parent. My husband Dave and I have 3 kids who are ages 14 and 18 and 20. Well, what we're going to talk about in terms of faith in an anxious world, it's never too early or too late to start thinking about these principles. I will say that as a researcher at Fuller Seminary, as a long-term youth leader, as a parent, not a day goes by that someone doesn't talk to me, reach out to me, ask a question about, send me some research about mental health. And by mental health, we mean anxiety, we mean stress, we mean depression, we mean suicide. Even prior to the pandemic, the best data showed that about 1/3 of the US population will deal with an anxiety disorder at some point in their lifetime. So that means 1/3 of us who are watching this now, and 1/3 of the kids are going to deal with an anxiety disorder in their lifetime. But if we look more closely at the pandemic, during the pandemic, anxiety has tripled, according to the CDC, across all generations. Anxiety has tripled, and depression has quadrupled. And while that's true for all generations, if we look specifically at 18 to 24-year-olds, about half of them are struggling with diagnosable anxiety or depression. Part of what's been so tough about the pandemic is there's unprecedented uncertainty. There's so much we don't know when and how it's going to unfold. Regardless of what's happening with schools, with kids' events in your area, the uncertainty about the vaccine, the uncertainty about what life is going to be like after the vaccine, what our churches and what our families are going to return to that's normal. This heightens our anxiety and heightens our kids' anxiety. Part of why I'm so glad that you as churches have come together is because schools are talking about mental health. The churches and families in our country, by and large, are not talking about it as much as schools are. As I said, I have a 12th grade daughter, and I have a sophomore in Sun College at Rice University in Houston, which means my part-time job for the last few years has been doing college tours. And I've done a lot of college tours, especially before the pandemic. And every time you walk around a college campus, they point out their mental health resources. They are talking about it. And sadly, in our churches and our homes, we're not talking about it. And that's what your youth pastors who've invited you here, that's what I want to end tonight. We want to end the silence about mental health and our families. And we want to make the church and the home one of the first places kids feel like they can talk about what they're really struggling with. Now, why is it important to talk about mental health? For a few reasons. We need to talk because of the kids we care about, because of the kids who are, say, our children or our stepchildren. But we also need to talk about it because of the kids our kids care about. Our young people, they're often seeing things in their friends that no adult has yet seen. In fact, Faith in an Anxious World is a youth ministry curriculum. It's also a parent podcast series. It's really a whole toolkit of resources for you. But one of the donors, one of the couples that funded these Faith in an Anxious World resources, they had a teenage son who was struggling with depression. They didn't realize how severe his depression was. He told a friend how he was feeling, but made the friend, another 16-year-old, promise not to tell anyone. Well, that young man ended up dying by suicide, and devastating, of course, the family and the friend who knew what was going on and honored the friend's ask to keep it secret. And so there are things that our kids and our stepkids are seeing in their peers. And we want to be a safe adult for them to come to about what they're seeing in their peers. Why are there more mental health challenges? This is a really interesting question. People ask this, like, why this sudden surge? And of course, the pandemic contributes, but even before the pandemic, why are we seeing such an uptick? Now, I can't give you a for sure answer. We don't know for sure the causation of what's happening with young people and mental health, but we do know factors that correlate. And I'm going to look at 5 factors with you that seem to have a relationship with mental health struggles. And I want you to be thinking about your own kids. Where are they perhaps vulnerable when it comes to these factors that can cause mental health challenges? The first is technology. Now, I love technology. Technology is what allows me to be here in my dining room in Pasadena, California, which is doubling as my office these days. And be with you in a sense. I love technology. What's interesting though, is when you look at adolescent risk behaviors, that the ubiquity, the commonness of smartphones is correlated with shifts in adolescent risk behaviors. Right around 2012, when smartphones became so common, certain adolescent risk behaviors decreased. You'll be glad to know that premarital sex, alcohol, drugs, overall partying behaviors have shown a slight decrease in adolescence. But also in this season when we've had so many phones, so much access to it, other risk behaviors have increased. And those are the ones we're talking about tonight: anxiety, stress, depression, and suicide. Now, my best interpretation of those shifts in risk behaviors is that the risk behaviors that a teenager did or does with other people are the ones that are decreasing. The risk behaviors they do on their own in their room are the ones that are increasing. Now, I graduated from high school in the class of 1987, go 87. And, you know, when I graduated from high school, if I was not invited to a Friday night party, I maybe heard about it on Monday morning. Whereas today's young people, when they're not invited to a Friday night party, they see pictures and real life, real time events unfolding on the device in their hands while they're in their rooms by themselves. If I was a teenager right now, I'm pretty sure I'd be struggling with anxiety because of everything that I would see that I wasn't a part of, and my fear of abandonment, my fear of rejection, that would make me feel left out. Now, I will say this is important with the pandemic when it comes to technology. There's actually some studies that are showing that technology is actually helpful for mental health. For kids who are feeling isolated, they can reach out, FaceTime, text, Insta, Snap, etc. So this is where you really need to know your kid and know, what in your kid's life when it comes to technology is helpful and what's hurtful when it comes to mental health. I mean, just getting super practical here. Like I've learned myself that I can't check social media on a Friday night or a Saturday night, because invariably everybody else's plans look more exciting than my plans or than my husband's and my plans. And so I'll start checking what everybody else is doing on Friday and Saturday night and feel like, man, our life is just boring. So I've had to put safeguards in because of how social media affects me, especially seeing what other people are doing. So certainly technology seems to be a factor. Here's a second factor though, and it's our parenting. I'm sure you are phenomenal parents, and your willingness to carve out a valuable hour of your time to be here today is a reflection of that. But a lot of times we put pressure on our kids, pressure to perform, pressure to achieve, pressure to get into the right fill in the blank, to be on the right fill in the blank. Not only that, but maybe what's more common is this generation of parents. We are helicopter parents. We are drone parents. We want to swoop in and protect our kids from pain, from struggle. And a wise friend and colleague of mine at Fuller Seminary, Scott Cormode, himself a parent of two 20-somethings, says what's hard about parenting is, on the one hand, you want to protect your kids from all pain. And on the other hand, you want your kids to have the kind of growth and resilience that only comes from pain. Oh, that is so true. So a lot of times we are preventing our kids from developing the muscles of resilience that they need because we are swooping in as parents. Busyness. Now, especially before the pandemic, almost every teenager I knew was too busy. Now we're actually have more downtime. I think in the midst of the death and destruction and what's been terrible about this last year, kids have more downtime, and that has been an overall plus. Lisa D'Amour is a very insightful adolescent psychologist who's done a lot of work on girls and even girls' anxiety, but it's what she says is just as relevant to boys for the most part. And she recommends that a young person have 25% of their time in unstructured downtime, not homework, not rushing to basketball or soccer or debate or drama or whatever it might be, but just downtime. It's a great rule of thumb. How is your kid doing at having 25% of their waking hours? I need to clarify, 25% of their waking hours in unstructured downtime. What else is happening in terms of why there are more mental health challenges? Our kids are lonely. They're literally isolated right now in some degree because of the pandemic. And then lastly, our brain biology. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I know that the brain is an organ, and just like our hearts, just like our kidneys, just like our lungs, our brain, our neurochemistry can get out of whack. And often we need prescribed medication or behavioral interventions from a mental health professional to really help us. So if a young person, or really any person, is struggling with mental health challenges, odds are good that at least one of these factors is involved. Now, for our next 15 minutes or so, we're going to look at how should we respond. We've looked at why is this happening, how should we respond? If you hear nothing else from me today, please hear this. Don't believe the lie that bringing it up is going to make it worse. A lot of parents are afraid that, oh, if I ask them about stress, if I ask them about anxiety, if I ask them about suicide, I'm going to plant a thought that they weren't thinking about. Let me just say, the typical kid is surrounded by messages of mental health, many of them really positive public service announcements, but they're hearing about it a lot. Let's make church and the home the first place that kids feel like they can talk about it, not the last. Here in the state of California, this is how common it is. There's actually been legislation passed in California that for every middle school and high school student, on the back of their ID card, public or private school, on the back of their ID card is printed the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Because a dad whose daughter died by suicide lobbied the legislation to put that on every student ID card. That's how common it is for kids in California to be exposed to it. And your kids, same kind of exposure. Most kids actually feel relieved when they get to talk about it, not resentful. And I mentioned earlier that we've done a whole host of research and resources under the umbrella of Faith in an Anxious World. We have a 4-episode parent podcast that's at this website, fulleryouthinstitute.org/anxiousworld. And we did interviews with therapists and researchers that we think are real experts on anxiety. One of them in particular, I mean, he's a therapist in Los Angeles. And if somebody needs, when I get a parent or step parent asking me for a referral, I usually recommend him. And so a lot of what I'm going to share is distilled from what we heard from these experts. And so I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version, but you can hear more yourself if you go and get those podcasts. And so Dave and I, with our 3 kids, we've tried to make this more discussable. These are our 3 kids: Nathan, our 20-year-old, Krista, our 18-year-old, Jessica, our 14-year-old. There was one season, it was May, 2 months into the pandemic, when the real extent of how long we were going to be sequestered was starting to sink in nationally. And there was this 48-hour period where I just heard so much about mental health with young people. Parents who were reaching out, leaders who were reaching out, heard about kids who were dying by suicide. And I said to my husband, Dave, I said, I feel like we got to talk to our kids about this. And so we tuck our kids in every night. They usually, they always stay up later than we do, but we still have a ritual of tucking them in. And so one at a time, as we tuck them in, usually just one of us will do it, but this time both of us did it together, and we looked at each kid in the eye. How are you doing? How are your friends doing? And I use this as I said what I have been hearing. I said, gosh, in the last 48 hours, guys, I've just heard so much about suicide. How are you feeling when it comes to your anxiety and your load? And I used what I was hearing as a springboard for a conversation. So if you're not sure how to bring this up with your kids or your family, you can use this webinar. You can use this talk and say, hey, this lady from California, she was talking about fill in the blank. I'm wondering, how are you doing? Feel free to use this as a springboard. How else shall we respond? It's interesting, when I looked at the research from the podcast and other research we had done, it seemed like there were 5 really important ideas, and they happen to spell out A, B, C, D, E. Now, I'm a little cynical about stuff like that when it's forced. Hopefully this doesn't feel forced. Hopefully this feels helpful and easier for you to remember. But ask. And we got this right out of the podcast, one of the podcast interviews we did with this LA therapist that I mentioned, Los Angeles therapist. Ask a young person, can you rate your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst? Friends, I asked one of my kids this question 4 days ago. This is a tool that I use as a parent. How is your anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst? Now, if your kid's a 1, 2, or 3, that is no big deal. A 4 or 5 is probably handleable, and that's where my child was when I asked this question this weekend. 4 or 5 is handleable. 6 or above is when you want to start thinking about getting extra support and extra intervention, involving a therapist, involving a teacher, talking to a pastor, talking to a small group leader, helping your kid talk to a few friends about it, etc. But as my husband and I were talking with our kid, who we were touching in, we just wanted to touch base on this issue. Like we said to our kid, like just know that you can always see a therapist. Like, we will make it possible for you to see someone if you feel like you need to talk about this. So I find this question an enormously helpful tool, even with my own kids. And sometimes your kids, if they're not very articulate, or maybe you catch them off guard, they might not know how to answer that question. And so you might need to suggest, gosh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it feels like you're maybe at about a 6 or a 7. What do you think? And let them respond to the initial diagnostic number that you tossed out. I'm seeing a lot of youth ministries and some families use this feelings wheel. And if you just Google feelings wheel, you'll get all sorts of versions of it. But basically, it's a way to help people talk more precisely about their emotions. So, I know one family where they've printed this out and they taped it to their fridge. And so, when they want to talk about emotions, they go to the feelings wheel. And this helps you, you can start with happy, sad, disgusted, mad, etc. And then you can get more and more sophisticated, more and more nuanced, more and more granular, as a way to help you stay in touch with your kid. So that's another resource that I want to offer. Then here's the B, breathe. Breathe. My whole life, I've heard the importance of breathing deeply, but it was only when we did this research that I realized why. Because when we get anxious, God's given us this gas pedal. There's this kick of adrenaline, the flight or fight response. Our heart starts beating more rapidly in order to get blood to all of our extremities. That's actually a good thing. The problem is when that stays activated too long. And so one of the ways that God's given us a brake pedal, just like God's given us a gas pedal, we also have a brake pedal, is to breathe, and especially to breathe deeply, If you've ever seen a kid going through a panic attack, often they have a hard time breathing. So we can help our kids practice breathing ahead of time. There's all sorts of breathing exercises that you can look up, do in the car, do it whenever it's convenient, etc. but helping your kid know how to calm themselves down by their breathing. C is to center on a helpful truth or phrase. And some of you might be wondering, gosh, Kara hasn't talked about the Bible yet. She hasn't talked about prayer. Like, what's the role of prayer and the Bible in mental health? It has a huge role. So I want to talk about that role, but I want to dismantle the idea that if you're feeling anxious, that means you're not a good enough Christian, or all you've got to do is pray harder and your anxiety will go away. Sometimes in my own life, I find that I pray and my anxiety lifts. But often there are so many deep issues happening that I absolutely need to pray and seek scripture. I also might need some additional help or support. But one tool that I like to give families is to center on a helpful truth or phrase. This can be a verse from scripture. This can be a few words from a poem. This can be a chorus from a worship song. Whatever would help your young people calm down. So in our family, our theological mantra, our theological anchor, I don't call it that around the kids, but that's how I tend to think of it, is Emmanuel, that God is with us, that God is with us. And so, I have vivid memories of our kids being 6 years old and on a ropes course and us yelling up at them in the trees, Emmanuel, God is with you. Like, that has just been a mantra. My son did a job interview 10 days ago. What did I text him? Emmanuel, God is with you. So that's a meaningful phrase for us. One of my kids, when they feel anxious, they find worship music, whether they listen to it or kind of, recite it in their minds. That's really calming for them. In fact, I was talking to this kid, and my own child, I'm trying to not give the gender. I was talking to my own child about how they were doing, and I said, maybe you should create a Spotify playlist of worship songs that you can listen to if you're struggling. And that child said, yeah, okay, maybe, and did create that Spotify playlist. So what is the helpful truth or phrase? This is where scripture and Jesus can be that rock that we stand on. Point D is develop your team. Develop your team. Parenting is not a solo sport. That's why webinars like these are so important, because you realize you're not alone. And hopefully in your church, you're feeling connected to other parents who help you know that you're not alone. And if you're not yet, then reach out to your youth pastors, because I know they want to connect you with other parents so that you know you're not alone. And so your team could be other parents that you're bouncing thoughts of, struggles off of. Your team could be a counselor. Your team could be your child's small group leader. Your team could be your child's youth pastor, a mental health professional. These are all the people who could be on your team. And help your child think about who they can talk to. If they tend to get nervous in physics, if that's when they feel anxious, is there another kid in physics they could text just who would say, who would, encourage them somehow? Is there a teacher? Is there somebody at their church? If they feel anxious at church events, is there an adult that they can talk to ahead of time who knows that, hey, they tend to get anxious on church retreats, so they might come to you if they're struggling. So think about how you can develop a team for your kid and how your kid can develop a team for themselves. And then lastly, empower through empathy. Empower through empathy. This is 2 E's really. But empathy is the way that we really feel with our kids, that we notice and we care. And empower is the way that we help them take steps forward. I mentioned Lisa D'Amour earlier. She has this great phrase that, oh my gosh, is so good for parenting in general. You can modify it, but it's fundamentally 2 halves. That stinks. There's the empathy, and you can handle it. There's the empowerment. So, that does sound tough. No wonder you're anxious about the AP test coming up. Or, oh man, I would be stressed too if I was wondering how my family was going to pay our rent and pay for food next month. Whatever it might be. That stinks. That's hard. And I think you can handle it. Or, sometimes what I'll say to my kids is, gosh, that does sound really tough. What do you think are some options for how you can move forward? So So it's two parts. It's that empathy, and then it's helping them identify next steps. And sometimes a child's not going to be able to do that second part. And so you might need to say, how can I help you? Or let's think together about some next steps. But you want to help them identify some next steps in this umbrella of empathy. As we've studied mental health around the country, tragically, there are clusters where kids tend to really struggle, geographical. So Las Vegas in the last 6 weeks or so has become a cluster of adolescent suicide, where there's more kids than average dying by suicide. A few years ago, it was the Bay Area here in California, especially Palo Alto, Menlo Park, right in the shadow of Stanford University. And the way that teenagers were dying by suicide in this community is they were stepping in front of the train that goes through these towns. Teenager after teenager was doing that. And so the city of Palo Alto decided to hire a security guard to stand on the tracks and to prevent kids from stepping in front of the train. Now, I'm really glad that the city of Palo Alto has done that. I think that's money well spent. But here's what I want. I want the church and I want families to be standing by those tracks also, helping kids, preventing kids from stepping in front of the train. And I want the church and families to be a quarter mile ahead of that, preventing kids from going any further, and a quarter mile and a quarter mile and a quarter mile and a quarter mile ahead of that. So that there's all these points of intervention that the church and families are offering. Because really, that's how we're going to have faith in an anxious world.